History really helps us to understand ourselves, understand others, and formulate the sorts of questions we need to deal with complicated times.
The Cundill History Prize was set up at McGill University in 2007. It was in fact endowed by Peter Cundill, the McGill graduate, who was very well known for his career in investment management, but someone who himself was a globetrotter and who relished the idea of thinking about how to celebrate history and bring history to a wider audience. Peter Cundill believed that by understanding history, we could better face some of the challenges of the present. And his incentive was to allow for not only students, but wider audiences of all kinds to become more familiar with great works of history.
It was agonizing deciding on this shortlist because the range and the interest and the weight of the stuff that came in was so impressive. I think one thing this prize has shown is the vitality of history writing.
One of the things that's most notable about this shortlist is how extensive, how global the questions that it deals with are. Now, of course, we have there studies of two particular countries, Vietnam and Russia, and also a wider study that draws in material from different sorts of countries and different sorts of time zones. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that these studies speak to something even beyond the particular subjects that they look at.
Christopher Gaucher's History of Vietnam was a revelation to me, and I think to many of the other judges. It took a country whose name is so familiar to us, especially those of us who are young and active in the 1960s, and made us see its history, which is often a tragic history, in the longue durée of Asian history and of a country that had an existence, a cultural, a political, a self-conscious existence long before it was made famous by interventions from abroad. It's also a book that's written, though not by a Vietnamese, from an inside perspective, from somebody who has immersed himself in the sources, who has learned the languages, who has studied the cultures, who has built into the story of the country the story of individuals and people, often tragically, often inspiringly.
Daniel Beer's book, The House of the Dead, is absolutely marvellous because it presents a kind of 360 view of history. We used to talk about history from above, then history from below, and now we have a kind of universality approach, which I think is both innovative and really important because you're both presenting different viewpoints as well as accepting that it isn't simply male history or working class history, it's the history of humanity. And so in the Beer book, which is the story of an immense tragedy over hundreds of years, Russian exiles sent into Siberia and the life that they made for themselves or failed to make for themselves in the gulags. And this is a story that is dripping with pain and blood and yearning, and it's an immense canvas. So to be able to bring in individual stories and that sense of what it is to be human and the story of the human heart is really a triumph.
Walter Scheidel's book, The Great Leveler, is going to get a lot of arguments about it. Because if you are somebody who wants more equality in your society, you're going to hate this book. Because he basically says, look, the only way you can really, really level societies is through one or more of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. You can have famine, you can have war, you can have pestilence, you can have plague. If you try to tinker with social policy and you think you're going to be able to substantially reduce inequality, you're not looking at history and you're not looking at the facts. Now, this is going to be a very controversial thesis. He's backed it up with an enormous amount of economic data. And so it's going to be quite unpopular in certain circles, but it's a book we think that you have to grapple with, even if you don't agree with the thesis of the book.
Well, I think the Cundill Prize is rather like Canada itself. Canada is a country that has been open to people coming from all over the world and to cultural influences from all over the world. And so I think it's very fitting that there should be a history prize, an international history prize, based in Canada. And history is something that belongs to us all. We need to know about each other's history, and so I'm very glad the prize is in Canada, is a Canadian prize, which is international.